Happy Friday, Year 6, and welcome to Story Time. We're going to be reading the next chapter in The Explorer. I love this book, and it's set in the Amazon rainforest, which is what we're learning about in geography at the moment. So just to recap where we're at, we've got our main character, Fred. We've got Leela and her younger brother, Max, who Leela seems to be very nice. Max seems to be quite young. And then we have Con, who seems to be a little bit rude and arrogant, but let's see how their friendship develops. Yesterday we read the chapter called Fire, where the children created fire using the steel from Fred's watch. And the question of the day yesterday was who gave Fred his watch, and it was Fred's father. We gather that their relationship wasn't so good. Fred was sent off to boarding school and didn't see much of his father. Now, think about why they might want to be lighting a fire. Maybe for warmth, maybe so they can boil the water so that it's healthy and clean to drink. Okay, let's read the next chapter called The Raft. Do you know what a raft is? It's kind of like a boat. It's when you put pieces of wood together to float down a river. Okay. It was Fred's idea to build a raft. He knew that it wasn't, by any stretch of imagination, what Con would call a reasonable risk. But following the river was the only way he could think of how to get home. The river moved fast, and the splash and spit and spray of it sounded like a summons through the jungle. "A raft," said Leela. "From what?" They were sitting in the clearing in the morning sun, clammy with sleep and dew. They'd slept inside the den, taking shifts to watch the fire. It had not been a good night. It had grown cold, and Max's feet, which had begun the night in their proper place, had ended up in Fred's left ear. Fred's brain had chewed up the fears he had pushed aside during the day and spat them back at him while he slept. He had woken screaming at dawn. "We'll make it from wood," said Fred. He swept up some of the dew from the grass around him and rubbed his face with it. "There's a lot of wood available." "Do you know how?" "I've read it in a lot of books about it," he said. In the books, explorers cascaded down rivers, shouting things like "tally-ho," but he assumed that it was not compulsory. And he'd read in an article on the front page of the Times about one man, Christopher McLaren, who had lived for months on a raft, eating fish and drinking river water. He had made it sound easy. "Why do we need a raft?" said Con. "It could get us out of here." "To England?" she asked. "To Manaus, and there would be people there who could get us home." "On a raft to Manaus?" said Con. Her voice was thick with disbelief. "People cross the Atlantic on rafts," said Fred. "They were adults. There's nothing that says only adults can make raft," said Fred, exasperated. "And you don't need a license." "Fred's right. We should try," said Leela. "I think it's a good idea." "I knew you would say that," said Con. "I knew you'd agree with him." "But," Leela looked bewildered, "don't you want to get home? Don't you want to see your mama?" "Of course I do," spat Con. Fred looked down at the floor. He'd heard Con crying in the night, calling for help in her sleep. "But if we just wait here," said Leela, "we'll wait until we die." "People will be looking for us. We should just stay here and they'll come," said Con. Leela shook her head. "The jungle is very big and we're small." "I'm not," said Max promptly. "You're small compared to 1,000 miles of rainforest, Max." "We can just send up smoke signals," said Con. "We already have some fire. Let's use it." "We'll have to burn down half the jungle to make one big enough to reach that high," said Leela. "And a fire that big would kill us instead of getting us rescued," added Fred. Con was going red. "I don't want to, all right? I really don't want to get on a raft and risk my life because someone else thinks it's a good idea." "It might not be a good idea," said Leela. but it's the only thing we've got. Fred's skin was beginning to ache and his stomach to clench. It always did when people argued. He stood up. I'm going to make a raft. You don't have to help if you don't want to. The raft took some time and involved more blisters than Fred had expected, but it quietened the roar of fear behind his ribs to be doing something. It's not going to work, said Con. Her arms were crossed so tightly across her chest that her fingers were almost touching at the back. The cut on her shoulder was still raw. And we shouldn't make ourselves hungry and tired when the only food we have is grubs. Fred said nothing and went on pulling immense branches down from the trees. Most were too firmly attached to be any good, but he had found that if he put his whole weight on them and swung his legs, every now and then one would break off with a satisfying crack. He worked faster and faster, brushing away leaves and insects as they fell in his eyes. Once the wood was piled in a heap, Leela heaved each piece to the fire. She laid one across the flames. When the middle burned away, they were left with two pieces of roughly equal length, each as long as she was tall. I'll take off the burnt bits, she said. It might as well look neat. She hacked away the burnt edges with a flint, getting steadily more covered in soot. I want to help, said Max. He strode around the clearing with his chest out, tugging liana vines down to the floor and piling them up. I'm actually the best at helping, he said. He sat down and began to make the vines talk to one another. Doesn't sound like he's helping. After a few hours, Con unwound herself from her angry ball of limbs. Silently, she approached Max. She took up one of his vines and a flint and began to skin back the rough bark on the liana to expose the softer core, thick as a rope and almost as supple. She covered her face with her hair as she worked and refused to meet anybody's gaze. Fred watched her from the corner of his eye. Con was different when she worked. Before, she had seemed all elbows and claws, touch me not, and defensive eyebrows. But now she seemed absorbed, barely breathing as she bent over the vines. Fred had never been as proud of anything as he was of that raft. It distracted him from the pounding hunger in his stomach and head. He hauled the branches to the water's edge, dragging them one in each hand, back and forth, beating out a path between the river and their clearing. Con held out a handful of liana vines. Here, she said, for rope, maybe, I don't know. We could dip them in the water to soften them, suggested Leela. Thank you, said Fred. They'll be perfect for tying the corners. Con nodded, unsmiling. Fred soaked the lianas and wound them round and round his fist until they were supple. His hands prickled with splinters, and he bit them out with his teeth. He sweated so much that his shirt turned into a sort of wearable pond. For lunch, they ate the cocoa beans raw. They were not delicious. It feels like an insult to chocolate to eat them, said Con. To try to fill their stomachs, they chewed on the white flesh that lined the pods, which tasted exactly like the rubber at the end of a pencil. This isn't food, said Max. His chin and lip were quivering. You have to eat it, Max, said Leela. There's nothing else. It tastes mean. Max dug his fist into his eye and tugged at his elbows. I want to go home. I know, said Fred. Me too. He decided he couldn't face any more grubs that day and set aside the last of the cocoa plant larvae. He turned back to the chunk of wood he was hacking into and jagged edge stone with a jagged edge stone. We're trying. All right, we'll stop it there for today. I hope you've enjoyed that. And we're going to ask a question in the question of the day about what we've just read.